Chapter 10 investigates the endocrine system of the human body. In this chapter, we'll explain the role of intercellular communication in homeostasis and describe the complementary roles of the endocrine and nervous systems. We'll contrast the major structural classes of hormones and explain the general mechanisms of hormonal action on target organs. We'll then describe the location, hormones, and functions of the pituitary gland, the thyroid gland, the parathyroid glands, and the adrenal gland. We'll describe the location of the pineal gland and discuss the functions of the hormone it produces. We'll also describe the location, hormones, and functions of the pancreas, as well as hormones produced by the kidneys, heart, thymus, testes, ovaries, and adipose tissues in the other organs with secondary endocrine functions section. Finally, we'll explain how hormones interact to produce coordinated physiological responses and describe how the endocrine system responds to stress and how it is affected by aging. For such large multicellular organisms to maintain homeostasis, every cell in the body must communicate with its neighbor, and with cells and tissues in distant portions of the body. Now, cells cannot talk to each other, so most cell-to-cell communication is done through chemical messages. Distant communication is coordinated by endocrine and nervous systems. The nervous system is fast, with very specific but short duration, and the endocrine system is slower, releasing hormones into the bloodstream that bind to target cells and have a much longer duration in its effects. Viewed broadly, the organizational and functional differences between the nervous and endocrine systems seem relatively clear, and that's why we treat them as different systems and why they have their own chapters in this book. Yet the two systems have very many similarities. Both rely on the release of chemicals that bind to specific receptors on target cells. Both share chemical messengers. For example, epinephrine and norepinephrine are hormones released from the adrenal medulla. Norepinephrine is also a neurotransmitter when released in synapses. Both are regulated by negative feedback mechanisms, and both can coordinate and regulate activities of other cells, tissues, organs, and systems with the goal to maintain homeostasis. This chapter will introduce the components and functions of the endocrine system and explore the interactions between the nervous and the endocrine systems. We'll be discussing the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, pineal gland, parathyroid and thyroid glands, adrenal glands, the pancreas. There are also a number of organs that have their own chapter that focuses on their primary functions, but can perform secondary endocrine functions like the heart, thymus, adipose or fat tissue, the digestive tract, kidneys, and gonads like the testes and ovaries. The endocrine system includes all of the endocrine cells and tissues of the body, as pictured on the previous slide. Endocrine cells are glandular and secretory cells that release their secretions into the extracellular fluid. The chemicals released by endocrine cells may affect adjacent cells only, as is the case of cytokines, or they may affect cells throughout the body. We define hormones as chemical messengers that are released in one tissue and, transported by the bloodstream, reach target cells in other tissues. Based on their chemical structures, hormones can be divided into the following three groups. Amino acid derivatives are relatively small and structurally similar to amino acids. Epinephrine, norepinephrine, thyroid hormones, and melatonin are examples of amino acid derivatives. The largest class of hormones are the peptide hormones. These include all the hormones secreted by the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, heart, kidneys, thymus, digestive tract, and pancreas. There are two classes of lipid-based hormones most derived from cholesterol. They are steroid hormones and eicosanoids. Steroid hormones are released by reproductive organs and the adrenal cortex. For example, testosterone and estrogen are steroid hormones. Eicosanoids coordinate local cellular functions. An example are prostaglandins. Hormones alter cellular operations by changing the identities, activities, locations, or quantities of important enzymes and structural proteins in various target cells. What determines a target cell's sensitivity to a given hormone is the presence or the absence of a specific target cell receptor for that hormone. The effect often depends on whether the receptors are located on the plasma membrane or inside the cell. Epinephrine, norepinephrine, and peptide hormones are not lipid-soluble. Therefore, they cannot diffuse through the lipid plasma membrane. Therefore, they must use a receptor on the outside of the membrane. The effect is not direct. These hormones are first messengers that activate second messengers in the cytoplasm. In this picture, the first messenger activates a G protein, which is an enzyme complex. This enzyme complex activates adenylate cyclase, which converts A2P to a second messenger, cyclic AMP or CAMP. CAMP activates kinase enzymes inside the cell, which phosphorylate another molecule and produces an amplification of the signal. For thyroid and steroid hormones, which are lipid-soluble, they can cross the plasma membrane to form a hormone receptor complex. This hormone receptor complex activates or inactivates specific genes to alter the rate of mRNA transcription and changes the structure or the function of the cell. Hormone release occurs where capillaries are abundant and the hormones quickly enter the bloodstream for distribution throughout the body. Within the blood, hormones may circulate freely or attach to special transport proteins. Freely circulating hormones remain functional for less than 1 hour and sometimes for as little as 2 minutes. They are inactivated when they bind to the target cell's receptors, or are absorbed and broken down in the liver and kidney, or broken down by enzymes in plasma or interstitial fluids. Hormones bound to transport proteins stay in circulation longer. These are typically steroid and thyroid hormones. Each of these hormones has an equilibrium between a bound and a free form, meaning that as the free hormones are removed, they are replaced by the release of bound hormones. Endocrine activity, specifically hormonal secretion, is mainly controlled by negative feedback mechanisms, meaning a stimulus triggers the production of a hormone whose direct or indirect effects reduce the intensity of that stimulus. In the simplest case, endocrine activity may be controlled by humoral stimuli or changes in the composition of the extracellular fluid. Endocrine activity may also be controlled by hormonal stimuli or changes in the levels of other circulating hormones. Such control usually involves 1 or more intermediate steps or 2 or more hormones. Finally, endocrine control can be triggered by neural stimuli, resulting from the arrival of neurotransmitters at a neuroglandular junction. Coordinating centers in the hypothalamus regulate the activities of the nervous and endocrine system in three ways. The hypothalamus acts as an endocrine gland, synthesizing antidiuretic hormone, ADH, and oxytocin. The hypothalamus secretes releasing and inhibiting regulatory hormones to control anterior pituitary secretions. The hypothalamus contains autonomic nervous system centers that control adrenal medulla through sympathetic innervation. And this brings us to our first checkpoint. This is a good opportunity to pause the recording and see what you've learned. Now let's move on to some of the organs and glands in the endocrine system, starting with the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland secretes 9 different protein hormones that bind to membrane receptors and all use cAMP as a second messenger. It is a small, oval gland nestled within the sella turcica, hanging below the hypothalamus by a slender stalk known as the infundibulum. The anterior lobe of the pituitary gland contains endocrine cells surrounded by a complex capillary bed. Capillaries provide a highway to the bloodstream for secreted hormones. These capillaries are part of the hypophyseal portal system. The hypophyseal portal system, blood arrives through the hypophyseal artery and branches into the hypophyseal first capillary bed. Regulatory hormones of the hypothalamus diffuse into the capillaries and travel through the portal veins. Regulatory hormones diffuse into target cells in the anterior lobe. The anterior lobe cells then secrete hormones into these secondary capillary beds. The hypothalamus controls the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland with either releasing hormones, RH, or inhibitory hormones, which is IH, or some combination of releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones. The anterior lobe of the pituitary gland produces 7 hormones. Thyroid-stimulating hormone, or TSH, is also called thyrotropin. Thyroid-stimulating hormone, or thyrotropin, is released in response to thyrotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. This triggers the release of thyroid hormones from the thyroid glands, which then cause a decrease in thyroid-stimulating hormone and thyrotropin-releasing hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormones, ACTH, is also called corticotropin. Corticotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus triggers the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone. This stimulates the secretion of steroid hormones called glucocorticoids from the adrenal cortex, and it increases in glucocorticoid feedback to inhibit adrenocorticotropic hormone and corticotropin-releasing hormone. The gonadotropins, or sex hormones, are triggered by gonadotropin-releasing hormone, GnRH, from the hypothalamus. The anterior lobe produces 2 gonadotropins, follicle-stimulating hormone, FSH, and luteinizing hormone, LH. Follicle-stimulating hormone promotes follicles and egg development in females. it promotes sperm production in males. Luteinizing hormone induces ovulation and secretion of progesterone in females, and it stimulates the production of androgens, such as testosterone, in males. Prolactin stimulates mammary gland development. In pregnancy and nursing, it stimulates the production of milk. Growth hormone, also called human growth hormone and somatotropin, stimulates cell growth and replication of all cells, but especially skeletal muscle and chondrocytes. Growth hormone stimulates the liver to release somatomedins, which trigger an increase in amino acid uptake by cells following a meal. It has multiple metabolic influences. And last, melanocyte-stimulating hormone, MSH, increases activity of melanocytes in skin. Although it appears to be non-functional in adults, it is active in fetal development, in very young children, and in pregnancy. This figure shows the typical pattern of regulation when multiple endocrine organs are involved. The hypothalamus produces a releasing hormone, which is abbreviated here as RH. This releasing hormone stimulates hormone 1 production from the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. Hormone 1 reaches some target endocrine organ and stimulates the release of hormone 2 from the target gland. Hormone 2 not only performs its effect on target cells, but it also performs a negative feedback on the hypothalamus and the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland by preventing the release of more releasing hormone and preventing the release of hormone 1. Examples are given here, including thyroid releasing hormone, corticotropin releasing hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone as well. The posterior lobe of the pituitary gland contains axons from two different groups of hypothalamic neurons. One group synthesizes antidiuretic hormones, ADH, and the other oxytocin, or OXT. These products are transported within the axons along the infundibulum to the posterior lobe. Antidiuretic hormone, also called vasopressin, is stimulated by an increase in extracellular fluid osmolarity, or a decrease in blood volume and pressure. The primary target is the kidney, and the goal is to decrease water loss. One of its effects triggers vasoconstriction to increase blood pressure. Oxytocin in women stimulates contraction of uterine muscles during labor and delivery. It also stimulates contraction of cells surrounding milk secretory cells in the mammary glands. Circulating levels of oxytocin rise during sexual arousal and peak at orgasm in both sexes. In males, oxytocin plays a role in emission of prostatic secretions, sperm, and secretion of other glands in the male reproductive tract. In females, it may stimulate contractions of the vagina and uterus, which is suspected to promote the transport of sperm towards the uterine tubes. This figure and Table 10-1 summarize important information about the hormones of the pituitary gland. We've reached another checkpoint where you can test your knowledge.